So these are going to be the top 10 best decks for you to climb with to Legend, and the first one is going to be none other than pure Paladin. It's at the top for multiple reasons. One, it is the highest win rate deck in the game. Two, it is in the highest win rate class in the game by quite a wide margin. Three, it's pretty easy to play. You basically just want to play a couple of minions early on and pump them with things like the Disco Maul, for Kael'thas, Hand of Adal, Seal of Blood, you name it, and you can give them Divine Shield. And the last thing is it's relatively cheap. If you don't have one or two of these legendaries, you can throw in a Grimstreet Outfitter, and it's not obviously as good, but it's still relatively decent. The only one you absolutely need is the Countess. The next deck on the list is going to be Undead Priest, which for a while fell off at the start of the expansion, but since then has risen back to the top of the meta. And the reason is for three main reasons. One, insane direct damage with things like your new hero power, Mind Shear, Shadowed Spirit, Rotting Necromancer, Shadow Word Undeath. The next thing is you can make some pretty sticky boards with Undying Allies to give your minions Reborn for that turn, Foul Egg, which spawns a minion when it dies, and then also High Cultist Basilisk, which means if your board gets wiped, he basically can resummon it the next turn. So your opponent always has to keep that in the back of their mind. And three, you got really good resource generation and draw, so you never run out of resources. Amalgam the Deep, Mind Eater, Psychic Conjure, the Location, as well as Grave Digging always keep you in the game. You never really run out of cards. The next deck on the list is going to be Frost Death Knight. Yes, it was just nerfed a couple of times by not being able to discover more Frostrim's Furies and Overseer Frigidara going down by 2 attack, but it turns out that this minion that almost never attacked anyway, going down to attack didn't matter, and not being able to get too many Frostrim's Furies doesn't matter. We can already deal about 80 damage over the course of a game. I will admit that you could still take out the Construct Quarter for the Rowdy Fan, but since it was nerfed to 3 attack instead of 4, it's not quite as good. It really comes down to personal preference, and the idea behind the deck is you just play things, do direct damage, freeze your opponent's board on turn 7 so they can't do anything, and then swing for the win turn 8. It's pretty standard. The next deck on the list is going to be Spell Demon Hunter. You run the Scythe, you run 3 minions, the Arcanist, Fellerin, as well as Lady Steno, and each one of them can give you different win conditions. Lady Steno with Sinful Brand or an empty board and a ton of cheap spells is an insane way to win the game. Silvermoon Arcanist with the Unleash Fel can bring you back into the game if your opponent was rushing you down, and then you also have Fellerin, which can give you some resources if you're in a position where you absolutely need them. This deck also has some good direct damage with the Sinful Brand and Small Rush minions, multiple weapons, as well as a couple of spells to just add on to all of that. The deck is just really flexible, a ton of cheap cards, and if you like doing a ton of things in one turn, probably the deck for you. The next deck on the list is going to be Blood Death Knight, and I will admit not being able to generate Soul Stealer, Alexandros, and most of all Vampiric Blood does hurt the deck quite a bit, but now you're able to generate the Asphyxiate, Blood Boil, Corpse Explosion, and Patchwork a little more consistently, so it kind of evens out, although it's still a little bit worse. Overall, the deck is just the best control deck in the game. It's got the best removal, best life gain, it's got the best life gain, Vampiric Blood gives you maximum HP, it's got some good tempo cards like the Screaming Banshee and the Gnome Muncher that gives you actual win conditions, and your late game is insane with Alexandros putting your opponent on a clock and Patchwork being probably one of the best disruption cards in the game right now. The next deck on this list is going to be Totem Shaman, and the only reason it is this low on the list is because it lacks consistently just a little bit. It kind of relies on Grand Totem Eyesore and Stonewright to really push for that win in the mid and late game, but you have a multitude of other win conditions that do make it at least a little bit okay. Bloodlust, Rotgill, Thing from Low, Gigant Totem, an early anchored totem with several 1-drops. You have other things that can still win you the game, so it's not that bad, but just know that there will be the occasional game where you're like, darn, I didn't really get to play, and because of that, I put it down, but overall, it's still one of the best decks in the game. The next deck on the list is going to be Unholy Death Knight, which did get hit by the same Death Knight nerf all the other decks got. You're not able to generate Grave Strength and Lord Marrowgar anymore because they are 3 rune cards. And yes, this does hurt you a little bit because sometimes a randomly generated Grave Strength would get you lethal, but for the most part, the deck will function the exact same way. You are able to just play for board, pump things up, sometimes make your opponent give you minions with the Blightfang, and then if you're not able to win with the Grave Strength on turn like 6 or 7, you play Lord Marrowgar after your board gets wiped and you win the game that way. The next deck on the list is going to be Hybrid Hunter. Now we're getting to the little bit more experimental decks, but overall the hybrid it goes like this. You have a ton of early game minions, a ton of 1, 2, 3, and 4 drops to get early pressure on the board, and then after that you have a couple of big minions, so you switch to a big Beast Hunter in the mid and late game, and then you try to close the game out with that. You also have some disruption with cards like Pozic as well as the Mr. Mukla to mess up their hand, and Blade Master Okani to counter a minion or a spell if you have control control of the board at that point. Overall, the deck does look quite promising. It doesn't have as big of a sample size as some of the other decks on this list, but it definitely is an up-and-comer. I would try it out if you have the cards. The next deck on the list is going to be Tony Druid, and its problems are the same as it's always been. It just lacks that early removal and survivability that some other decks have. So if you go against something that's really good early game, you will probably lose. But against pretty much everything else, this deck does really well. If they give you any wiggle room, you are able to get to the point where you can wipe their board with Mishmash Mosher plus the Attorney at Maw. You can lock them out of the game with the Jailer along with Tony. You're able to generate giant top minions with Anubercon, Underking, and Zoc. And there's really just no shortage of what this deck can do. Also, the Hero Power package, just in case you need to do a little bit more direct damage. It's really flexible, and as long as you aren't going against hard aggro, this deck is really good. The next kind of experimental deck on this list is going to be Fatigue Imp Warlock. Now, this deck really got buffed because of the Crescendo as well as Crazed Conductor. Crazed Conductor going to 4 mana might not seem like that big of a deal, but it gives you another viable 4-drop play other than just Mischievous Imp. Helps your mid-game out a ton. And then also buffing Crescendo doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but being able to play it a little bit earlier means you can more consistently pump up your Crazed Conductor, or you can use it late game for some direct damage if you absolutely need it. Other than that, it runs very similarly to old Imp Warlock of the past. You play Fiendish Circle, you give them Death Rattled so your board is really sticky, and then Vile Library and Imp King or Faum can buff up an already existing board or regain you a board. And then you also have Drathir, which is a great way to do a little bit of direct damage at the end of the game. The last deck on the list is going to be an honorable mention, one that is just my personal deck of the list, and it's going to be the Control Priest. Control Priest is probably the second best control deck in the game right now behind Blood Death Knight, so if you don't want to play that, you should probably play this, and it's not even close. I don't know what other deck really comes close in terms of control right now, and it has a ton of healing. It's got really good removal. It has inbuilt silence, which is something that Death Knight doesn't have. So in some niche matchups, this could actually be better. And then you also have some mana cheat and resource generation with Love Everlasting and all of your Discover cards. Overall, this is the second best control deck out there, and I've had a blast with it. I've had a pretty decent amount of success with it, but again, control decks are slow, so even though your win rate might be higher than normal, you're playing less games, so you'll climb a little bit slower, but it'll feel good when you're doing it. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys want to see another tier list, I'll probably be coming out with one next week as the meta settles a little bit more, but right now, these are the early front runners for the best decks in the game.